For those of you that don't know, this is my brother Chuck. He's a presidential historian. We bounced around a little bit back and forth in time, and we are back on track with the presidents, and we do a deep dive into different presidents. And we've gone pretty far back, and we know this gentleman. Every time we look in our wallets, hopefully we have a couple of these laying around. And Chuck's going to talk today about the life and legacy and history of President Andrew Jackson. So take it away, Chuck. If you guys can just keep your, I need to do this myself. I hope I can do this easily. Keep yourselves muted, keep your questions to the end, and then we will get to all that good stuff at the end of the program. Okay? Thanks, Chuck.
Okay.
Welcome.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Michelle, and welcome to all attending today's discussion on the seventh president, the legendary, the controversial Andrew Jackson. The controversy about Andrew Jackson goes back to his day for sure, and continues probably more strongly today than it has at any time in the past. We'll look into some of the more current aspects of the Jackson presidency, as well as some of the details of the actual presidency. So once again, welcome. There he is, truly the man, the myth, and the legend. One of the historians I researched doing this project quotes, paraphrasing him, it's something along the lines of, this man's life is more fanciful than a fiction story, but from what we know, most of it is real. The only question about the accuracy of his story would be from his childhood, which basically is derived wholly from stories from Andrew Jackson himself. So we'll have to take his word on some of the earlier stories, but then we get into some more public domain type stories and some legends you may have heard, some you probably haven't. So we'll have fun with it too. So here we go. Andrew Jackson, born in March of 1767 in one of two states. It is not officially known what state he was born in, which of the Carolinas. It was either North or South Carolina for sure, and Andrew Jackson himself always claimed that he was a native South Carolinian. So we'll go with that statement, and we'll call him a native of South Carolina, but it's really close to the border. Currently, there are 4 markers depicting his birthplace, 2 in North Carolina and 2 in South Carolina. So they're still debating to this day, but that's really neither here nor there. Where he was located, though, in this region of the then pre-United States, was a very, very stronghold of the British sympathizers. And during the Revolutionary War, when Jackson was just a young boy, the British soldiers had pretty much overtaken his region in the Carolinas. So the legend, again, it's from Andrew himself, so it's not corroboratable, but the legend goes that soldiers came into his place of residence. His father had passed away when he was very young, so he was with his mother and his 3 brothers, I believe it was 3. The British soldiers came in and took them captive. One of the soldiers demanded that Andrew Jackson shine his shoes, and Jackson refused. And this is the scene right here entitled Brave Boy of the Waxhaws. The Waxhaws were the mountains in that region on both sides of the border. And here you see the depiction of a British soldier about to slash young Andrew Jackson. He was about 13 or 14 at this time, early 1780s. And he indeed received a very, very large scar on his face and another on his hand. That does seem to back up the story. His brothers both passed away in captivity, his mother shortly thereafter. So basically, this is the beginning of the end of his childhood. Shortly thereafter, he is orphaned and abandoned and left on his own at about the age of 14. This is from a Currier and Ives depiction from the late 1870s. So we move on to the first known actual depiction of Andrew Jackson. And this is a little bit later in his teenage years, perhaps up into his early 20s. I had never seen this portrait before this research, so I found this to be an interesting one with the crazy hair, which he seemed to always have. But this is at a period of time when Andrew Jackson is, again, on his own. He's studying for the law. He's studying under a lawyer. He's reading. And he's also spending an inheritance, which I had a hard time finding more information about. But apparently, he did receive a small inheritance from a relative in Ireland, which he was spending at about this time. He's also developing a reputation at this time as an absolute prankster, a wild, partying gadfly, and someone who really enjoyed pulling stunts and having fun with his fellow citizens. And a lot of these stories are pinpointed into the town of Salisbury, North Carolina, which is one of the first towns he set up shop in. One of the anecdotes from this period is his hiring two prostitutes to show up at the Christmas party in town, which did not go over very well, as you might imagine. Another one of his recurring stunts was to take outhouses in the middle of the night and move them to undisclosed locations, which again, just a bizarre hobby, you might call it. But again, it led to his reputation as kind of a crazy man. He was known to participate in brawls frequently. There's one story of him and his friends dismantling a tavern, right from the glasses right down to the building itself. They just destroyed a building one night. And these are corroboratable stories from some of his contemporaries. So we get to see a pattern of a real loose cannon, one might say. And again, still showing his brilliance in studying and then passing the bar exam and becoming a lawyer in the mountainous region of North Carolina. We move on to the next picture. This is a portrait of a friend of Andrew Jackson. This is a man named John McNary. Next slide, please. John was a local lawyer and later a judge. Jackson studied under him and was somewhat younger than McNary, not way younger, but enough of an understudy situation that he was able to, McNary was able to become somewhat of a mentor to Jackson. They had a falling out, which was not uncommon for Andrew. He was, again, developing this reputation as being extremely hot-headed and extremely volatile. So McNary and Jackson had a falling out, which ended decades later at the request of McNary. They had a series of letters exchanged, which reestablished their friendship. And I'm just bringing this up to point out that although Jackson held grudges and was a very vindictive and vengeful person, he was able to build and repair fences that had been broken. So that's to his credit. We'll meet another one of his early encounters in this mountainous region of North Carolina into Tennessee. Tennessee was originally part of North Carolina, and it wasn't established as its own state until the late 1790s. And this is the period we're talking about here, 1790s, early 1800s. The next slide will depict a founding father of the state of Tennessee, a man named John Sevier. And it's hard to believe. Somehow he looks a lot like George Washington. We've commented on this before. But with Sevier, you actually have a person who makes Andrew Jackson's future encounters with Native Americans look pretty tame. John Sevier was a far more experienced Indian fighter and a far more experienced lawyer and politician. And so again, this is a relationship of an older man and a younger man that ends up falling into a rift. Sevier ends up challenging Mr. Jackson to a duel, and we'll cover the subject of duels a little bit more later. There's plenty to talk about with that subject, but Sevier with a falling out in the early 1800s, challenges Jackson to a duel. And what happens with Sevier ends up being a general street fight. Sevier and Jackson never actually duel, but their seconds end up dueling, and then the town ends up falling into a riot situation. So again, wherever Andrew Jackson is, there's going to be some activity, there's going to be some action, there's going to be some excitement, not always of the good kind. And so we continue on with this is Andrew Jackson's love. This is the woman he met back in the 1780s, Rachel Robards Jackson. When they first met, she was a married woman, and she was also about to undergo a divorce at this time from a man named Robards. Rachel assumed that the divorce was properly filed and then proceeded to get married to Andrew Jackson, only to discover 2 years later that her husband never filed the divorce papers. And again, this goes back to the early 1790s. It's about a 2-year period where Andrew and Rachel are married when they find out that Mr. Robards had not officially filed for divorce. So then the divorce is finalized. Andrew Jackson is married once again officially now to his wife, Rachel, who he remained happily married to for the rest of her life. Unfortunately, though, this is the origin of many, 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 many stories disparaging Jackson and his wife, basically calling her a bigamist because she had been married to 2 men at the same time, technically, and also impugning Jackson's reputation as someone who would carelessly get married to a married woman. These allegations, which weren't made up, they were real, haunted both the Jacksons for the rest of their lives. These allegations and stories would come up repeatedly, especially after Jackson entered public life and first ran for president in 1824. It's the vitriol and the embarrassment that basically is the cause of a large percentage of the duels that Jackson participated in. Basically, you insult his wife, there's going to be some fighting, there's going to be some gun activity going on, and it happened plenty of times. Now, again, going briefly into the dueling story, which we'll pick up a little bit again later, there's a big discrepancy on the history of Andrew Jackson and dueling. The numbers of duels he was involved with are unknown. The numbers just simply aren't known, but the guesstimates range from 2 duels to 103. And I believe the reason for this widely disparaging number comparison is simply that duels are not defined very rigidly as one might think. The organization that claims Jackson only fought in 2 duels is his own foundation, the Hermitage Foundation. This is the house that he bought in the early 1800s with Rachel, and we'll see that next. I believe that's next on our list, so we can go ahead to the next slide. This is the Hermitage, still standing, still a tourist attraction. It was the #1 tourist attraction in Tennessee prior to Graceland, and also Dollywood have now surpassed the Hermitage, but still a very popular site. Eventually was developed into a plantation by the Jacksons. They raised thoroughbred horses. They also sold and bred slaves at this plantation. But again, back to the dueling, the Hermitage site was Jackson's home base for 40 years after the purchase of the site. But again, it goes back to his earliest days as a politician, where this basically was the first house in Tennessee to come see. This was the mansion. This was the place of stopping over when dignitaries were passing through, and there weren't many at the time. It was still an undeveloped frontier area. This is now near the large city of Nashville. And at the time, Tennessee was in its infancy. But one of the earliest visitors to the Hermitage site was a former vice president who was, some believe, on the run. Some believe he was heading west to try to separate part of the West from the United States. And his name is Aaron Burr, and we'll meet him next. Aaron Burr shows up on the scene sometime around 1806, 1807, shows up at Jackson's estate looking for advice, looking for help. And indeed, Burr was involved in a plot, very unorganized, not close to fruition, but involved in a plot to separate part of the Western United States at the time into his own nation. And again, this is a disgraced vice president. He had just shot and killed Alexander Hamilton and was antagonizing President Thomas Jefferson and such. And so he was basically looking for assistance on his trip west. Jackson was cordial at first and then realized this might not be a person I want to get involved with right now, and basically sent Burr on his way. But when the treason trial came up later for Aaron Burr, Jackson was questioned as a potential accomplice and a potential, at least, witness to the story. Jackson disavowed any connection with Burr, and that was true. And Burr went on to his own legal issues after that. So we once again come across a portrait of a young Andrew Jackson. This is after his military career had started, and there he is as Major General. This was painted in about 1819. So this is after a lot of his exploits that made him nationally famous. His national prominence comes into play starting with the War of 1812, without question. His major focus early in the war is in Florida, and it's against the Seminoles, who were taking sides with the British. Jackson took many actions into his own hands, often against the wishes of his superiors, or at least not with full permission, and basically took over Florida as a military ruler would do. Several controversial incidents abound during his Florida experience. One of them was the court-martial and eventual execution of 6 soldiers. Another was the execution of 2 British subjects who he claimed were plotting against the United States. And during this time period, with the Monroe presidency showing not full backing. This is after the official war had ended in 1815. Very few people in Washington were behind Andrew Jackson and his activities against the Seminoles. One of the few was John Quincy Adams, who we met last time as Secretary of State. He did believe Jackson had the authority to do what he did. Now, the story going a little bit backwards to the War of 1812, the story that finalizes his heroism and his celebrity is the Battle of New Orleans, which I believe is our next. No, it's not our next one. This is going to be our next slide. Will actually be one of the natives he was treating with. This is William Weatherford, who was, I believe, 3/4 Caucasian, 1/4 native, and his native name was Red Eagle. And this is a treaty conference that took place in Florida during this period. We're talking about 1816, 1817. And this is a supposed to be a final settlement with the tribes in the southeast, and it ended up not being a final settlement of any kind. This just began the negotiations, which were broken, and then the treaty conference would happen again, and then that would be broken. So this was a pattern of Jackson's. He had no trouble making treaties with Native Americans. They called him Sharp Knife. That was their name for him. They recognized him as almost a George Washington-like figure, in that they saw him as having supernatural powers, as being able to defy death, because they'd seen him in so many situations where most people would have died. And again, he just kept defying death, and he became kind of a scary, legendary figure amongst the natives, and it'll get scarier later when we hear about the Trail of Tears. But this is an early treaty that Jackson had no trouble signing and then breaking shortly thereafter. So this was Jackson's trend: treat and then do whatever you needed to do. And we'll also go back now and we'll see a painting depicting the Battle of New Orleans. And this took place in 1815. And this is, again, the battle that put Jackson on the map. There probably was no scene like the one you're depicting here exactly, but it certainly was a slaughter. The British troops came in unprepared for the ambush that they faced. Jackson's sharpshooters picked off a number of British regulars, and it was a pretty lopsided victory for Jackson and his troops at New Orleans. And this took place again in January of 1815. On January 8th, which became known as Andrew Jackson Day in many circles for 150 years after that fact. So again, that is no longer celebrated today, but for a long time, this was the supreme victory of U.S. troops in any battle, even though the war had ended 2 or 3 weeks earlier by treaty. It's just that the treaty confirmation did not reach the United States until after this battle had ended. But again, this made Andrew Jackson a celebrity. It put him in a position of a political career, which he hadn't really had prior to this. And again, it led to him sitting down for paintings and portraits, and allowed people around him also to gather up this momentum of a potential political leader. So we see the origins of that here at New Orleans. And now we're going to meet some of the people who saw the potential in Jackson as a candidate. Now, what you see here is an actual kitchen cabinet, as you can tell, nothing really fancy there. Jackson had his own kitchen cabinet, and this term became popular after he became president in 1828. But the people who became the kitchen cabinet weren't in the cabinet yet, but these were all the influencers. These were all of the media folks, and these were the influence peddlers who gathered the storm together to breathe life into the idea of Jackson being a politician. And we'll meet 3 of the most influential members at this point. Our first kitchen cabinet member is Amos Kendall. He was the elder statesman of the kitchen cabinet folks. He was a New Englander who went to Kentucky, became a newspaper editor, eventually purchased a paper in Washington, D.C., which became the mouthpiece of the brand new Democratic Party. That's right, the Andrew Jackson era is the beginning of what we now know as the Democratic Party. And here you can see Amos Kendall as literally one of the founders of the Democratic Party in his advocacy of Andrew Jackson. We also meet another influential editor from the Kentucky area. This is Duff Green. He was an educator as well as a publisher. He was someone who backed Jackson up until Jackson split with his vice president, John Calhoun, who we'll meet in a little bit. And then Duff Green takes Calhoun's side and becomes a Calhoun supporter and becomes an anti-Jacksonian. So just as easily as Jackson could have people blowing wind into his sails, he also had people turn on him quickly and become arch enemies. And this would be an example right here, Mr. Duff Green. And our next kitchen cabinet member would be one of the more mercurial folks in 18th century politics and media. This is Francis Preston Blair, who I think at one time or another was in every political party of his era. So he starts as a Democrat and he ends as a Democrat, but he also helped found the Republican Party in between. And his role mainly, again, is as a media mouthpiece. He is a brilliant editorialist. And while he is a Jackson supporter, he certainly is influential in influencing people to support him. Although, just as quickly, as I mentioned with Duff Green, he turns and basically becomes a supporter of the Union by the time the Civil War rolls around. So, again, these are some of the people behind the people that we know. And we have a few more to meet also. The next image will be of Major Andrew Jackson Donaldson. This is Andrew Jackson's nephew, and he becomes basically the press secretary for the 8 years of Andrew Jackson's presidency. His wife becomes another important part of the White House scene, and we'll meet her next. She is Emily Donaldson. And again, this is the niece-in-law, I suppose you would say, of Andrew Jackson. She is the White House hostess during the White House years, because before Andrew Jackson gets into the White House in 1828, his wife passes away. Many believed it was due to the stress over the controversies regarding her marriage and her alleged bigamy. So Jackson, of course, never forgot this, and was happy to have young relatives help out. In the case of Emily, she was basically the hostess, although it wasn't a very festive White House during the Jackson years, and it's because of his general mourning over the loss of his wife. Now, there is a split between the Donaldsons and Jackson, and we will learn about that in just a little bit. Donaldson does not stay on as the White House hostess until the end. She is replaced at a point due to a break in the relationship with Uncle Andy. But until then, we're just going to talk some politics and the steps that led Jackson to the White House. We go back to 1824, and we're going to look at the presidency of John Quincy Adams again, just briefly. Jackson isn't really a candidate himself in 1824. He becomes a candidate thanks to the efforts of people like Duff Green and Amos Kendall, who we just met, who are starting to espouse him as a legitimate candidate. By the time the election rolls around, Jackson wins a plurality of the vote, and he also wins the most electoral votes, but does not win enough to claim victory. So that election got sent to the House of Representatives, where, as we learned last time, John Quincy Adams was chosen in what the Jackson supporters called the corrupt arrangement, the corrupt bargain. So for 4 years between 1824 and 1828, there's this natural buildup of the Jacksonian feeling. And it does, like I just mentioned, lead to the formation of an entirely new party, the Democratic Party. But at this time, it's almost inevitable that Jackson will sweep into the presidency in 1828. So we see a concerned John Quincy Adams in the White House, but John is not going to participate in electoral politics. He never did. But his people certainly did. And this is something they came up with in the 1828 campaign. The next slide will show something called the Coffin Handbills. And this would have been a series of public advertisements, basically, and they're basically trying to remind people of the violence that's on the hands of General Jackson. The 6 coffins shown are supposed to depict the 6 deserters who Jackson executed during the wars in Florida. However, going deeper into the coffin handbills, I determined that that was the lightest of the accusations, because Jackson certainly did execute these six soldiers for deserting, but the accusations go deeper and actually accuse Andrew Jackson of being a cannibal, of eating these 6 people and also eating Native Americans who he had roasted on the stake. And there is no evidence of this from any other source. Soldiers who were there, officials. Again, this is seemingly entirely made up to highlight and exaggerate the dangers of Andrew Jackson. But again, I was surprised to see accusations of cannibalism. That would be new in presidential campaigns, as far as I'm concerned. The next the next political piece we see is from a little bit later, from the 1830s. And again, this is trying to remind people of the dueling history of Andrew Jackson. This is depicting the only duel that ended in a fatality. This is depicting an 1806 duel with a man named Charles Dickinson. In this particular event, Dickinson had insulted his wife, basically, once again. And it also could have something to do with a horse gambling event, a horse race event gone amok. At any rate, the duel is arranged. Dickinson fires and lodges a bullet right in Jackson's chest, right next to his heart, shattering some ribs. Jackson, unfazed while bleeding profusely, lifts up his gun and shoots Dickinson dead. And many felt he broke the code of dueling, the code duello, as it was called, by firing a shot after his trigger had jammed or something like that. So again, it wasn't simply that he was a duelist, it's that he was not even an honorable duelist. They were trying to make that clear. And again, it was kind of fun going into the research of the dueling. And I mentioned the discrepancies between the historical accounts. You know, he participated in between 2 and 103. Big number difference there. But again, going more into the history, it seems like this was already, dueling was already disparaged in the north of the United States. It was really a Southern thing. And it really pointed to the code of honor. Again, to refuse a duel would be to be considered a wuss or a wimp or a sissy or whatever. To accept a duel and to fire in the air was the generally accepted way. So this way, both parties could be relieved of responsibilities while not also being a murderer. But again, this was a fading part of our culture at this point, and to some in the South, it lived on up until the Civil War quite strongly. So we see this depiction, and we see the controversy even today over his dueling career. And we're going to meet a man we met last time. This is John Calhoun. Looks very surprised here that we're talking about him. John. Again, we mentioned a little bit about him last time. He was John Quincy Adams' vice president. He carries over and becomes Andrew Jackson's vice president. And then they have an extreme falling out over mostly the concept of nullification. John C. Calhoun, also a South Carolinian, believed that federal authority, when aggrieving a particular state, allowed that state to nullify federal law. This was a controversial concept from the very beginning. It goes back to some of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's writings from about 30 years prior. But it was kind of a kernel of a thought that started growing as the nullification crisis grew. And basically, this was a refusal for South Carolina to pay tariffs. They were denying the federal government the right to impose tariff law on them. And this is an important part of the second administration of actually, it's the end of the first administration of Jackson. And we do see that one of his strongest statements is about the nullification crisis. And I will read you the statement. This is written by his Secretary of State, Edward Livingston, who we'll meet in a little bit. Here's his quote. "I consider, then, the power to annul a law of the United States assumed by one state incompatible with the existence of the Union, contradicted expressly by the letter of the Constitution, unauthorized by its spirit, inconsistent with every principle by which it was founded, and destructive of the great object for which it was formed. This is basically the basis of Abraham Lincoln 30 years later denying the concept of secession. It's the same argument that states have no right to secede, states have no right to nullify federal law. And this does set a very strong precedent for our country. This ensures we're going to be together for better, for worse, as presidents that follow this lead in blocking the rights of states to call their own shots. And we go to the next slide, and we'll meet the man I have just been talking about, Mr. John Quincy Adams, who during this period, in his attempt to get reelected in 1828, realizes that he's up against a phenomenon. He's up against a political figure of charisma and a political figure that's like sweeping the nation. And John is resigned at this point that the nation is preferring a mobocracy rather than a democracy. And this is a rough period for John. He sees this growth of the media is also a part of this story. And John is actually happy to be out of the White House. He does not go to the inauguration in 1828. He quietly steps back to Massachusetts just for a little bit until he reemerges on the scene in the 1830s in the House. And so we have John's story. And so now we're going to meet a little bit of the main players, anyway, in one of the biggest controversies during the Jackson administration. This is John Eaton, a personal friend of Andrew Jackson's from Tennessee. He is a biographer of Jackson, writing some of the campaign biography material, and is given the position of Secretary of War in 1829. And he takes over the position with a controversy ready to go, brewing and simmering and ready to go. And the controversy stems around his wife, Peggy. The story with Peggy is that she was the daughter of a Washington tavern keeper, and she was known for her gregarious and flirtatious nature. You might compare her a little bit to Dolly Madison, also a very famous hostess. And Peggy gets married, and her husband is lost at sea. So while this is not officially declared a death, she ends up meeting and dating and then marrying this man, John Eaton. So the marriage is a bit controversial because there hasn't been an official death certificate filed for her missing husband. And at the same time, bringing Peggy Eaton into the circle of cabinet wives was a big no-no for the Eatons and for Jackson. Miss Peggy Eaton, who I believe the next slide shows her, Miss Peggy Eaton was absolutely shunned by the female the wives of the cabinet members. Some vehemently. Calhoun's wife couldn't stand her, and even Emily Donaldson, Jackson's niece, would not talk to her. It was a complete snubbing. It wasn't even a down talking or trash talking. It was basically, that woman is so low, I'm not going to acknowledge her existence. And it becomes a problem not only in the personal and social affairs of the White House, it becomes a problem politically too, because now you have his entire cabinet. They're all standing behind their wives, and they're saying, look, something's got to be done because our wives are really calling the shots here, and it's interfering with business. And it really did. This became an obsession of Andrew Jackson's, defending Peggy Eaton. And many believe his strong defense of John and Peggy came about as a result of his own wife's passing, and having passed under a cloud of controversy, meaning a cloud about her bigamy. He felt extra defensive towards Peggy Eaton. And it's not simply that he liked her, he did, but it was also that he felt like he was defending his wife perhaps as well. The lone cabinet member who survived this affair was a man who became president next. And we'll see him in the next slide, Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren went from being the Secretary of State to the Vice President and for the second term. He was Secretary of State during the first part of the first term and then became the Vice President after Calhoun stepped down. And Martin Van Buren was an experienced and polished politician. I'm not saying that he chose sides in the Eaton case based on that. I do believe he sincerely had no problem with Peggy Eaton, and it's partially because he was a bachelor. He had no wife involved in the controversy. So he simply went along with the president and stayed in his good graces as a result and ended up becoming the next president as a result. So positioning himself properly during the Eaton affair, which also became known as the Petticoat affair, you may have seen that in the caption, was a key part for Martin's political future. We also come across the other really large part of, there were actually three large parts of his presidency besides the Eaton affair. We have the nullification crisis, which we've discussed. And the next crisis, which some of you are probably familiar with, would be the Supreme Court decision that sided with the Cherokee in a long-standing case. We'll meet our next. Oh no, this is okay. I forgot about the rats. Okay, we have another little funny cartoon here. This is actually the results of the Eaton affair. The rats leaving the cabinet, and you can see Jackson's right foot is on the tail of Martin Van Buren, the rat. So this is an example of what I was just discussing, how the Petticoat affair ended up disrupting business and changing the cabinet quite radically. So we go on and we meet the Supreme Court Chief Justice in our next slide. This is a man named John Marshall. We had scheduled to do a presentation on Mr. Marshall in the past. We hope to revisit that. But Marshall's decision in the Cherokee case was monumental, and he basically sided with the natives, saying they have no right to be dispossessed by the state of Georgia. They have every right to stay where they are. They're making all their advances towards becoming a civilized nation with their they have now a way to communicate. They have a written language. They have a court system. They're emulating the greater society in their attempts to assimilate. And Marshall respects that, and Marshall sides with them in a very, very long and arduous case in front of the Supreme Court. Jackson's response was, let Marshall enforce it, because as much as he as much as he wouldn't back down in the nullification case, as much as Jackson stood up for the federal government in the nullification case, he did the exact opposite in this case by allowing the state of Georgia to remove Native Americans. It coincided with Jackson's belief that this country should be made clear for Caucasians. I mean, that was his goal. And Marshall's decision disrupted that goal, but he ignored it. So again, it's this weird juxtaposition of being a strong proponent of our federal system and then being a complete disregarder of our federal system, all within the span of a few years. Quite remarkable. And again, in siding against Marshall's decision, he allows for the Trail of Tears to happen. This is the Indian relocation story from 1830 that became known as the Trail of Tears. And this was not simply a executive order or some sort of legislative idea. This was an obsession of Jackson's from the moment he got into the White House to clear the way for white settlement. So in ignoring Marshall's decision, he basically got his way, and the Trail of Tears story spells that out. Our next slide is from a man from New Jersey who looks remarkably like Abraham Lincoln in this picture, Theodore Frelinghuysen, senator from New Jersey. The Frelinghuysen family is still going strong in New Jersey, as far as I know. It's truly a dynasty. But this man, under Christian principles, strongly stood up against Andrew Jackson in the Senate and denounced his Indian removal plan and his ignoring of the Supreme Court in multiple speeches, in very, very vehement terms. He stood up for the natives in this story, and I just had to throw him in there because he is a piece of New Jersey history. Also became the mayor of Newark as well. And the next man we've met briefly, he is the Secretary of State who is the strong voice behind the nullification statement, and this is Edward Livingston. He was a New Yorker, a contemporary of Aaron Burr's and Alexander Hamilton's in the field of law. He ended up losing everything in the early 1800s, losing all of his possessions due to a case of internal fraud. Someone who worked for him basically ripped him off. He ends up relocating to Louisiana, becoming a Louisiana senator, and an influential member of the Jackson administration. Worked for 2 years as Secretary of State following Van Buren, and then he's appointed Minister to France. Here's a guy who gives the Jackson administration a sense of cultivation and of an aristocracy, which they weren't known for. And the next person we'll meet, also part of the second term Jackson story. This is Nicholas Biddle. He was a gentleman from Pennsylvania, I believe from the Philadelphia area, who was the proprietor and the administrator of what was known as the Second National Bank. And this was the second attempt by the federal government to start its own currency circulation system. This was considered, as I think it would be today, quasi-constitutional. There's no real directive in the Constitution to do this. When it passed, it had plenty of controversy behind it, but it seemed to be a functioning system, loosely arranged as our Federal Reserve System is today. It might be comparable in some ways to the Federal Reserve in that it's kind of a quasi-private, quasi-government organization. Jackson used the bank as a whipping post, basically. That was one of his earliest tirades when he first ran in the 1820s, and again when he became president. One of his goals, just as he had his goals with Native Americans, one of his goals was to destroy the Bank of the United States and in the process destroy this man, Nicholas Biddle. So we'll see from our next depiction, it's a cartoon accurately showing General Jackson slaying the many-headed monster. And this would be Jackson's going after each individual regional branch of the national bank and decapitating it, basically, and forcing the relocation of the funds to other state, local, privately owned banks, getting it away from this unaccountable federal bank. At least that was his description of it. And this is a very, very vivid portrayal of that. And we will see another 1830s cartoon put out by his enemies. And this is a kind of a fake playing card entitled King Andrew the First. And this is the title he was given in honor, I suppose you would say, or in light of his extremely draconian presidential style. He did things not out of consultation meetings, not based on think tanks. He acted impulsively and he acted arbitrarily, and this got him the title of King Andrew the First. Now, interestingly, in the story of King Andrew, there's a story of another king that plays into his second term, and it's the story of a man named Richard Lawrence, who was a house painter in the Washington, D.C. area. He had been born in London, England, moved to the States, painting houses. Now, remember in those days, house painting, you're using obviously lead-based paint, and you might be influenced by fumage coming up from the paint and such. So there were signs that Mr. Lawrence was a bit imbalanced, increasingly so. Friends and contemporaries were saying things like Mr. Lawrence was claiming that he was the King of England, that he actually was a king from 1407, and that Andrew Jackson, of all people, was blocking him from taking his just seat at the throne in England. So Mr. Lawrence gets it in his head that he has to knock off King Andrew to get his own throne, King Richard, or whatever he was calling himself. So Richard Lawrence takes 2 pistols loaded into the Senate chamber where a funeral gathering is breaking up. It was a funeral for a representative from the South, and Jackson was attending, not in good health now. Again, Jackson, from all of his duels, had bullets in him. One report said he sounded like a bag of marbles when he walked because of all the jingling going inside of his body. So Jackson attends this event with a cane, looking frail, but still there. And Lawrence sees the opportunity, and shoots one of the guns point blank at Jackson's stomach. It does not go off. It explodes, so the cap explodes, but it doesn't trigger the full effect. So doesn't do anything. And so they're not sure at first. There's a bunch of smoke. Are you okay? Did he get hit? Meanwhile, Jackson, who obviously is fine, takes his cane and he's about to start hitting this guy over the head with it when he pulls out a second gun, point blank. Now he's even closer to Jackson, pulls it out, point blank. Again, does not go off. It blows up, so the cap explodes and all the powder got triggered, but no firing. And they ended up jumping on him. They move Jackson away. He still wants to hit him with the cane, of course. And Lawrence is taken away and eventually tried and is declared insane. So this is one of the earliest times someone is using the insanity defense at a trial, and it works. He gets away with, I believe, sentenced to insane asylums for the next, I believe he lived another 30 years. So he lived a long life in confinement after his attempted assassination. But again, this just adds to kind of the mantra of impermeability for Andrew Jackson. Like you can't even shoot him point blank because the gun will explode, but it won't fire. Like it's just more examples of his popular kind of mythological nature. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about finish up with the assassination. Now we'll go to the next slide. And this is the person Andrew thought was behind the assassination. He was convinced it was a plot. He was not convinced that it was a lead inhaling crazy guy that tried to shoot him. So it turns out this is a man named George Poindexter. He's a senator from Mississippi. And he had been a Jacksonian supporter. He had a falling out with Jackson to a degree prior to the 1835 assassination attempt. But there's some connection between Lawrence and who is the assassin, the would-be assassin, and Poindexter. And the connection is starting to be talked about. Like Jackson gets word that Poindexter was in on it because he was seen talking to Lawrence. There's affidavits, witnesses see Poindexter talking to Lawrence. Turns out Poindexter was talking to Lawrence because he had hired Lawrence to paint his house. That's the only connection that is known between Poindexter and the assassin. However, Jackson was obsessed with this to the point where he basically had Poindexter sent back to Mississippi, and he lost his reelection campaign. Jackson certainly helped in that, and Poindexter's political career was over. He ended up going back to be a lawyer in Mississippi, never to be heard from again. So again, there was a lot of paranoia with Jackson. There was a lot of just real uncertainty about who his enemies were. He thought most people were his enemies. So this is the reaction of a man just absolutely possessed with paranoia. I'm going to now read, before we get to our final shots here, I'm going to read a couple a couple of important little side notes. Now Jackson is considered like the father of populism. Um, he saw the office of president as a protection against the power usurpers in the House, Senate, and Supreme Court. So this concept of the president as the voice of the people really isn't in existence until the Jacksonian era shows up. I don't. As much as Washington seemed to be a voice for all the people, I don't think he viewed the presidency as that. Uh, Andrew definitely did see the presidency as a vocal mouthpiece for democracy and a way to keep the other parts of our tripartite system in check, but only in a more loud and forceful way. When he's leaving the White House in 1837, he's asked a question, a very simple question. Do you have any regrets upon exiting the White House? And his quote was, I regret that I was unable to shoot Henry Clay or hang John C. Calhoun. So again, always about vindictiveness. It's always about the vendetta. And it's interesting also to think of him as a founder of the Democratic Party. One author put it this way, because he's now basically been shunned by the Democratic Party. They used to celebrate his birthday. They would celebrate Jackson Day on January 8th. Now it's much more subdued, if at all discussed. And one author said, for the Democratic Party to dismiss Jackson, it's like being unfriended on Facebook by your fan club, by your own fan club. So it is interesting to see, going back also to his earliest biographers, as we can move along to the next slide as well. His earliest biographers have an interesting way to put this. He called Jackson, this is James Parton, his first biographer, a thoroughgoing human fighting cock, very kind to the hens of his own farmyard, giving them many a nice kernel of corn, but bristling up at the faintest crow of Chanticleer on the other side of the road, end quote. The author throws in his own comments, so now we know why the chicken crossed the road, to get the hell away from Andrew Jackson. So again, a man of mixed talents. He would, again, use his anger to his advantage. He would scare people just to see him shaking. He held that as a power over people. And some believed he wasn't even held together by flesh and bone, but by sheer vengeance. Again, a fierce person, loyal to his friends, and vicious to his enemies. And this is what another author had to say. His story is a reminder that history is painted in shades of gray and brilliant colors rather than in black and white. And the heroes of yesterday become problematic when considered with modern sensibilities. Again, to put him simply as a product of his times is not quite there. I mean, there is an element of truth to that, of course, but he's a product of all time. He is not a product simply of his times. He's truly a remarkable character. He truly is larger than life. For example, with all of his disparaging and all of his dispossessing of natives, he saved a native child from a battlefield and raised him as his own son, Lincoya. So there are these contradictions. There are these anomalies when you do the research. But again, we see a lot of these same themes coming back around to bite us today. We'll go to the next slide and we'll see a modern depiction of Jackson. This seems to be an attempt to pull a Hamilton. When I came across this this is about 2008, 2010. This was an off-Broadway show. I think might have made it to Broadway, but it's a comical, topical depiction of Andrew Jackson called Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson. The subtitle is History Just Got All Sexy Pants, which just made me laugh. And again, I think it's an attempt to both modernize, personalize, and familiarize young folks with Jackson. Going online, it's very, very full of opinions about Andrew Jackson, from apologists to champions to haters. I mean, the Andrew Jackson fever is still there on both sides and in both extremes. But what I can gather from this particular fictional view, it's pretty much accurate. It's not only fiction. Basically, it's an attempt to modernize and to make more familiar the true story of Andrew Jackson and the true story of his truly brutal nature. And our final shot will show. Let's see, what do we have for our final shot? Do we go to the? Yes, we go to the Jackson-Trump connection. Well, there is no question that there is a connection between these two gentlemen. Trump posted a portrait of Jackson when he entered the White House in 2017. Rudy Giuliani made a comment about how this was just like Jackson winning in 28. Basically, the drain the swamp theme is something that has been recurring. Jackson loved to say things like it's time to get rid of the Washington insiders, and he came in and appointed all of his unqualified friends to positions for the most part. So would you rather have Washington insiders or would you rather have unqualified friends? You make the call. Another connection is simply his own belief in himself was astronomical. It was unquestioned, unparalleled. Just as you never heard Trump back down on anything, he's never admitted fault to anything publicly, in my knowledge. Jackson never did either. Jackson was pedal to the metal. You make a mistake, you ignore it. You act like you didn't, and you just plow forward with the next thing. Very, very similar belief in his own persona, to such a degree that any outside influence was just going to deflect off of him. Literally, when you talk about a kitchen cabinet with Jackson, at least he did use a coterie of insiders for credible uses, for the nullification statements. I mean, I don't think Jackson could have come up with those words himself. And I'm going to conclude by reading something also from his first biographer, which I found really, really summarizes him very well. Well, let me read something first by a man named Bob Duncan. He's a Tennessee historian. He writes, "If Jackson were alive today and still the president of the United States, he would most certainly feel duty-bound to shoot the whole Congress and the entire Washington press corps. It makes me nostalgic just to think about it." And that's Bob Duncan being sarcastic, I hope. And here's a comment from the 1840s, and it's remarkable how honest this quote was from someone who was considered a friend, a man named James Parton. "Andrew Jackson, I am given to understand, was a patriot and a traitor. He was one of the greatest of generals and wholly ignorant of the art of war. A writer brilliant, elegant, eloquent, without being able to compose a correct sentence or spell words of 4 syllables. The first of statesmen, he never devised, he never framed a measure. He was the most candid of men and was capable of the profoundest dissimulation. A most law-defying, law-obeying citizen. A stickler for discipline, he never hesitated to disobey his superior. A democratic autocrat. An urbane savage. An atrocious saint." And I will conclude on that note. And I will be happy to talk about anything, questions. There he is on the 20. By the way, putting Jackson on the $20 bill was to smack him in the face. Because of his anti-U.S. bank actions, I think some real wiseacres decide, let's put him on the $20 bill. Yeah, that's a good idea. That'll serve him right. And that's why he's there, just to spite him. So any questions, comments, be happy to help.
Wow, we're stunned. Anybody we want to chime in and talk to Chuck? Tell him your thoughts. Do you have any thoughts, Bob?
Yeah, Chuck, can you recommend which of the books that you read on Jackson do you think that most of us would really appreciate reading?
That's a good question. I'm gonna give you a few names. The most recent, most comprehensive is a biography by Robert Remini, and it's a three volume. So it's detailed, to put it mildly. 3 volumes. Robert Remini, Remini.
It's a 3-volume book.
I believe so. Yes.
Okay.
And I just want to throw out another name. Now, this person I'm not exactly sure if he's done a book or not, but there's a series of columns online that I found, and they were most entertaining. And the person's name is Howard Dorre, Dorre.
Can we get that online, you think?
I don't know where you'll find him exactly, but if you punch in the words Andrew Jackson duels, that's where I came across his writings, because he does a lot of they're kind of humorous, kind of modern versions of some of the older stories. I really like the way he does it. He's the one who came up with the now we know why the chicken crossed the road, which I started laughing with that one. That was good.
Yeah, right. Anybody else want to talk to Chuck? Unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment. Go right ahead. Tom's here. Here he comes.
I think that they talk about Jackson as a product of his times, but he's also a product of his youth. I mean, when you look at what he experienced, I mean, this is a guy. His father died at 29 in a logging accident. He had 2 brothers. One of them died during a battle in the Revolutionary War. And then right after that, him and his brother are in that incident where they're told to polish the boots. They don't. He's slashed across the face with a saber. They're sent to a prison ship where they are malnutritioned, and they both end up with smallpox. They're released then to their mother, and his brother dies 2 days afterwards. And then his mother, trying to minister to other POWs, dies of cholera. So he experiences all of this at the age of 14. At that time, I was graduating from 8th grade, and I was playing, stickball outside in the park and such. You wonder how, when you look at what an obstinate, what a driven individual he was, how these types of experiences in the course of his youth, to be orphaned at 14, and he almost died of smallpox himself, because he and his brother both contracted smallpox in the POW camp. I mean, to have those kind of experiences, at that age, I wonder how that would affect any of us in terms of our growth.
Absolutely. It's a big part of his story, no question about it. I think what's interesting about the research on Jackson, I think we're seeing more widespread views into his story, and that's one of the things they're looking more at now. Youthful experiences leading to his adult behaviors. Again, it's refreshing to read from a wide variety of time periods too, because there are phases of Jackson in our history. We've looked at him differently from the moment he's been on the scene till today, and it hasn't been just like he was all good and now he's all bad. It's been much more cyclical, like a roller coaster. And to read a biography from like the 1920s, I mean, you're reading about the hero of all heroes of all time, when slaughtering Indians wasn't looked at as the wrong thing to do. So it's remarkable. And then you read more recent history, especially from younger authors. The hatred towards Jackson is visceral. It comes through the pages. In fact, I believe it was this Howard Dorre person who has a whole essay about Andrew Jackson being like from a horror picture. He's like He's like Chucky. He's like Freddy. He's like he's like the worst horror movie character coming back to life. There's even a story on his deathbed, on Andrew Jackson's deathbed. He's pronounced dead. He's in a chair or something. He's dead. He's not breathing. And then he comes back to life all of a sudden, and he has a few more words to say, and he scares the heck out of everybody because he's a creature from the Black Lagoon or something. There's even a picture of him wearing his black coat, his like an evening coat with the red interior, right next to a picture of a vampire, and it's like it's the same. They're wearing the same clothes. It's very bizarre. But again, our views have changed of him from the moment we knew about him, and they continue to evolve, devolve, and move along. But his childhood is such a big part of it, and again, his early adulthood is a big part of it too, because that's where the reputation is cemented as someone you just can't really trust. You just don't know what he's going to do next. It's that impulsive hooliganism that's kind of part of his presidency too, not as far as moving outhouses, at the White House, but as far as his unpredictability goes. It was there.
It's funny the Trumpsters trying to adopt him as one of their own as well, because he was an individual. He would have despised Trump because he was a man, and this was from his hatred of the British as well, and the British system. He hated the aristocracy and he hated the privileged. He was truly a champion of the common man, as long as the common man wasn't Black or Native American and such.
Yes,
But yes. I mean, whereas like he hated the aristocracy and was for the common man, Trump is an aristocrat who basically despises the common man.
Absolutely. Good point. And there's another point to make in that same context. It's the point that Jacksonian democracy is directly connected to the expansion of suffrage, the vote. It's the expansion of the vote that goes now to white males over 21, not necessarily landowners anymore. State by state, the rules were being lessened on who can vote, and that expands the voting population, which expands his popularity to a large degree. John Q saw that. John Quincy Adams saw that connection. He mentions it a few times. It kind of gets overlooked, but it's a big part of it. More people are voting, quite simply.
Chuck, did you tell me that I don't know if you mentioned it in the talk, I may have missed it, but that Trump, with the coaxing or suggestion of Steve Bannon, put Jackson's portrait in the Oval Office. Did you tell me that?
Well, he definitely did. I don't know who prompted that. I don't. It probably wasn't Donald himself. Yeah, somebody probably told him to do that. Right. I mean, come on. But I mean, Giuliani quotes Jackson as well. The night of the election, Giuliani says, "This is just like Jackson in '28. Washington back to the people." So trying to equate Trump with the populist is been the big part of that connection. Drain the swamp. I mean, that's literally right from the 2016 campaign. I don't remember hearing that before then. I mean, Jackson was saying almost the same exact words. But again, you could drain the swamp, but if you replace it with swampier people from your home district, you're not getting anything better. You're getting stinky, miasmic, fumage. It's not really helping anything. And again, he did that. His attacking the privileged aristocracy was replaced by the good old boy system. It was replaced by the victor goes the spoils system. And the origin of that phrase comes right around from that time frame. Yeah.
So you drain the swamp, but you get an algae bloom. Everything dies.
And even with that, go ahead.
Do you remember that insane about that portrait of Andrew Jackson? One of the many insane scenes I remember during the Trump presidency was that they went and they took the Native American code breakers, the code talkers, and they gave them like medals. And they gave them the medals in front of the picture, the huge portrait of Andrew Jackson. And it was one of those things that was so baffling to watch, to have them there in front of this guy whose picture they would have loved to have ripped down. It's like, we're here to honor you, and let's honor you in front of the guy who kicked off the Trail of Tears and the Native Americans being thrown off their land and so on. It was just.
Yeah, that's a good point. I forgot about that lovely little tidbit. I did want to mention though, like, you're talking about the algae bloom again. Okay, so you drain the swamp and you replace it with people who all bail on you over the petticoat affair. I mean, that's another thing. Like, these are your friends, and you had to fight with those people too. And you had to get all new friends because all your old friends didn't like Peggy Eaton, the wife of the Secretary of War. I mean, it seems to be not the petticoat affair. To me, it was the petty affair. Forget about the petticoats. This should not be something disrupting national business, yet it definitely was. It was all the diaries from that era. Everyone's talking about it. It's really the focus of attention.
Sue, did you have a question or a comment? Sue? I see you unmuted, Sue. Sue, did you want to say something? Sue? You're unmuted, Sue. You want to talk? You have a comment? No? Okay.
You know, a really interesting quote by Jackson that he said after the nullification incident. He said the tariff was the pretext, was only the pretext, and disunion and Southern Confederacy were the real object. The next pretext will be the Negro and the slavery question. So he basically, observing them, understood the idea that the South was looking to break away at that early period of time, was looking for a pretext to do it, and that they would eventually use the whole idea and the whole question of slavery as something, as a means by which to try to have their own separate nation. He called them out exactly for what they were intending to do.
That's a good point. And also, this came up just today, preparing this morning. My thought came to the idea of if Jackson had lived to see the Civil War, what side would he have taken? Here's a slave owner. He owned over 100 humans, and he was a slave trader. He simply wasn't a slave owner. He bought and sold and made money doing it. Although the Hermitage site, and I have to warn you about going to the Hermitage site online, it's very biased. It's very slanted, and that's the site that says he was only in 2 duels. They're couching things a little bit, into a pro-Jackson stance, which I understand. But as far as his nullification stance juxtaposed with his slavery ownership, where would he have fallen as a slave owner during the Civil War? And he was from a state that was very conflicted with the Civil War. Tennessee was about half and half. Not a lot of slave owners there, really. Not a lot of plantations in Tennessee. The mountain country was full of Unionists in Tennessee. So his own state was divided. How divided would he have been had he been around to see the Civil War? It's hard to say. He was very pro-Union, but he was very pro-slavery too.
You mentioned Aaron Burr as well. That would be an intriguing person to do a little bit of a discussion on, because he is a peculiar shadow over the early nation. Yes. Trying to create his own country and killing Hamilton too, though I've never really shed a tear for Hamilton, because Hamilton was one of the great champions of the idea that only the wealthy should be allowed to vote, only wealthy landowners, whereas that was the idea of Hamiltonian democracy versus Jeffersonian democracy, where Jefferson said, no, the common man should be able to vote as well.
Right. Yeah. Yes, very true. Hamilton was a soft money guy too. Like, let's build up huge debts and to gain our credibility. That was also Hamilton's notion. As far as Burr goes, one of the most challenging things researching Aaron Burr is that there's hardly any information from him personally. I think it was mostly destroyed on purpose. He also was not a diary keeper, didn't write many letters. And it was intentional. Historians believe that Burr kept a very, very low profile on purpose, because he didn't want to have his life researched and studied by historians, because he was kind of an opportunist who would bounce around depending on what was going to be beneficial to him. There's not a lot of consistency when you do the research, and I think he just wanted to keep that under wraps, because I've seen this before. There are some more contemporary biographies of him, but they're difficult to piece together because of the lack of a trail on Aaron Burr.
Chuck, you got to read Gore Vidal's book, Burr, because Gore Vidal's take on him, he presents this completely new take that it was Burr who was the great champion of the early republic, and it was guys like Washington and Adams and Jefferson who were connivers and villains and dunces. He presents this whole ulterior history of the early republic.
I'm familiar with some of his work. That would be fun to revisit Gore at this point. Yeah, it's just such a great writer, but just a different view really does kind of open your brain up a little bit to other possibilities. So yeah, that's a good thought.
Yeah, that's always fun. Chuck,
Yeah.
why don't you tell us what's on the horizon November 4th at
Well,
3:30?
we're gonna do a little election kind of a roundabout, you might call it. We're gonna talk about election day in our country, why it is when it is, what the controversies were originally, some of the earlier fun elections, and again, we're going to keep it light and airy for the most part, nothing too controversial or sinister. We'll try to keep things bubbly and happy.
All right, Chuck. Thanks so much once again. Thanks everybody for coming and listening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.